Welcome to Real Crusades History. This is J. Stephen Roberts. I want to say thank you to everybody who has been watching the videos. Also, I want to tell you, if you have not done so yet, please do subscribe to Real Crusades History. Become a part of the Real Crusades History family that we have going on here. So today, what we're going to talk about is Visigothic Spain. A lot of people are aware that Islamic Spain, an era in Spanish history which began in the 8th century, did eventually develop this high level of culture and learning and a pretty impressive intellectual tradition. But what a lot of people are not aware of is the fact that Visigothic Spain, prior to the Islamic conquest, already had a thriving and impressive literary and philosophical culture and an environment of learning. This is not surprising, of course, because Spain, prior to the Visigothic conquest, had been a part of the Roman Empire, which of course was an absolute bastion of learning and literacy. And Spain had those Roman institutions present already that fostered that. There was a brief period of kind of chaos where some of that was interrupted in the 5th century when the transition was going on from Roman rule to Visigothic rule. But as you get into the 6th century and the 7th century, this starts to be reestablished, and it thrives, in fact. And not surprisingly, of course, it is centered around the monasteries, the monastic tradition, priests and the religious clerical men of the period are sort of the guardians and the advocates of literacy and philosophy and learning. An important figure from the intellectual tradition of the Visigoths was Saint Isidore, 599 to 636. I'm going to read a little bit from Joseph F. O'Callaghan's A History of Medieval Spain. And O'Callaghan says of Isidore, he was a man of great learning and broad intellectual interests, with a great enthusiasm for the wisdom of the past. A prolific writer, his works include the Regula Monachorum, the Liber Senatarium, a clear and systematic summary of theology, and the Liber de Officiis Ecclesiastis, a manual of instruction for the clergy. He also wrote 2 historical works, a chronicle, recording events from creation to the 4th year of Sigebut's reign, that is to 616, and the Historia de Regibus Gothorum Vandalorum et Suevorum, extending to 624. Isidore's Historia begins with the famous De Lauda Spaniae. Of all the lands there are, from India to the west, thou, O Spain, sacred and always happy, mother of princes and of peoples, are most beautiful. Study of classical authors from the pagan world was alive and well in Visigothic Spain. O'Callaghan continues, Saint Isidore exercised his lasting influence on the Middle Ages through his Etymologiae, the first of the medieval encyclopedias. In 20 books, he set out to summarize for the benefit of future generations the learning of the ancient world. The breadth of the work is indicated by the table of contents. After treating the 7 liberal arts, medicine, and jurisprudence, he turned to God, the angels, man, the state. The remaining books discuss such a variety of subjects as human anatomy, animals, cosmology, geography, minerals, metals, coins, weights, measures, agriculture, war, architecture, clothing, food, drink, and tools. Now we can see in St. Isidore, too, this idea that was a very common and powerful theme for medieval Christendom, and that is this idea that rulers who do not rule justly do not deserve to rule, and in fact should and will lose their kingdoms. This is from St. Isidore. The kingdom is so called from kings, just as kings are so called from ruling. Now he does not rule who does not correct. Thus a ruler acting rightly keeps the name of king, but by doing wrong he loses it. Hence among the ancients there was this proverb, you will be king if you do rightly. If you do not, you will not be. So St. Isidore really became an important part of medieval Spanish heritage and memory. He was read and beloved for centuries after his death. When we get into the 11th century even, Fernando I of Leon asked one of his Muslim vassals, the Emir of Seville, to hand over the body of St. Isidore, which was buried in Seville, to hand that over to Fernando's men so he could bury him in a brand new cathedral that Fernando had built. And of course, this was done by that Muslim emir. So the intellectual tradition continued in Visigothic Spain. St. Braulio, the Bishop of Zaragoza, 631 to 651, did some compiling of Isidore's etymology, and that's actually the present form of it that we have today. I'm going to continue reading from O'Callaghan. Several learned men graced the See of Toledo during the century. Among them were Eugene II, an astronomer, Eugene III, a poet, Saint Ildefonse, and Saint Julian. Ildefonse, 659-667, a Goth, served his apprenticeship as a monk and abbot before his election as bishop. The last great author from this period is Saint Julian, who also was heavily devoted to both pagan and Christian learning and books and authors. O'Callaghan says he is best known for his Historia Rebellionis Pauli, his vigorous denunciation of the treacherous Duke Paul, coupled with a smoothly flowing narrative full of life, ranks his history as the best of its kind in the Visigothic period. O'Callaghan ends his discussion of Visigothic intellectual tradition with this paragraph. Within 20 years of Julian's death, the Muslim conquest destroyed the Visigothic kingdom and interrupted the scholarly tradition to which St. Isidore had given such impetus. In the long, bleak centuries ahead, however, the Christian people still drew inspiration from that group of scholars whose work had enlightened the Visigothic age. So what O'Callaghan is saying here is not that the Arabs didn't later also develop their own intellectual traditions. They did, but his point is that at the time of the conquest, in the 8th century, they were basically interrupting an intellectual tradition that already existed. And it would take some time before they built up their own. Because remember, the Arabs who actually conquered Spain were illiterate, barbaric type of men, not unlike the Visigoths who originally conquered Spain when it was held by the Romans. And he explains this a little bit better in a later chapter. As the Muslims extended their rule over the provinces of the Byzantine and Persian empires in the 7th and 8th centuries, they came into contact with the philosophical and scientific thought of the ancient civilizations. Gradually assimilating the wisdom of the past, they developed a distinctive culture which, under the patronage of the caliphs, flourished at Baghdad and eventually spread throughout the Muslim world. The first Muslims to enter Spain, however, were rude barbarians from the deserts of Arabia and the mountains of Morocco, whose contact with Greco-Roman civilization was still minimal. During the first century and a half of their domination in Al-Andalus, civil wars and rebellions, the illiteracy of the masses, and the stringent thought control of the Malikite jurists did not provide a suitable environment for the flowering of literature and learning. So we can see now, when we're looking at the history of Spain, we have to understand that the intellectual and literary traditions of Spain go back very far. They go back to classical civilization. The Romans already had established a flowering and productive culture and literary civilization in Spain. There was interruption of this in the 5th century when the Visigoths conquered it. But gradually, the Visigoths, who already were fairly Romanized when they entered into Spain already. In fact, pretty quickly, the Visigoths adopted Roman civilization as their own. And this learning, this literacy, this cultural flowering reestablished itself in the following centuries, the 6th century, the 7th century of Visigothic Spain. So the Spain that was conquered by the Arabs already had a flowering literary culture, a flowering intellectual tradition. Once the Arabs conquered it, once again, outsiders, once again, unlettered, illiterate, they conquer Spain, and again there's an interruption of that. In the 8th century, we see that interrupted, and it's going to take time for the Arabs to become a part of that literary tradition and establish their own literary and philosophical culture in Spain. And then in Christian Spain, In medieval Christian Spain, the Reconquista era of Spain, we also see a flowering and brilliant literary tradition. So Spain really does have a long history of culture, of civilization, of learning that stretches way back. And Visigothic Spain is very much a part of that. The Visigoths had a thriving intellectual tradition. Now, this book I was reading from, I hope you guys will check it out. It's called A History of Medieval Spain. It's by Joseph F. O'Callaghan. He's one of the foremost historians of medieval Spain. The publisher is Cornell University Press. So do jump on Amazon, look up A History of Medieval Spain, get this book. It goes from the Visigoths all the way to Isabel and Fernando's conquest of Granada. It's huge, and it's just a magnificent history of Spain. Thanks very much. I hope you guys enjoyed this. Please do subscribe to Real Crusades History if you haven't done so already. Also, if you like what I'm doing, please do make a PayPal donation to Real Crusades History using the PayPal link in the About box of this video. Also, if you haven't already, please like Real Crusades History on Facebook. Thanks.